Okay, so you know how much we all love to just dive deep into these complicated topics.
Yeah.
Because you want to get past all the headlines and the hot takes,
Right.
and actually figure out how things really work.
Exactly.
And today we're tackling something that's so incredibly relevant.
Mm-hmm.
It's libel law in the U.S. It's not just about someone's reputation anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's becoming this like strategic tool.
It is.
And that has some pretty big implications for what we can say, what we can hear.
Huge implications.
So,
you know what's so fascinating about this deep dive is the material that you've gathered. It's
Yeah.
like your own notes, news articles, and then this book, murderthetruth.pdf.
right.
I mean, that's quite a collection.
It is.
And our mission here is to
Yeah.
connect all these dots, find the key shifts, and really paint a clear picture of where libel law is headed and why it matters so much.
Yeah. And to really get a grasp on what's happening now, we kind of have to go back in time a bit.
Right.
To this foundational case, New York Times v. Sullivan.
Yeah.
This is the one that brought us the actual malice standard.
Exactly. Back in 1964, the Supreme Court kind of recognized that when we're talking about public officials,
Yeah.
there has to be some room for honest mistakes.
Right.
Discussions about public figures, those are going to get heated.
Of course.
So this actual malice standard basically means that for a public official to win a libel case, they have to prove that the statement wasn't just false,
Right.
but that it was made with knowledge that it was false,
No.
or with reckless disregard for the truth.
Yeah.
It's a high bar, and it gave the press and just public debate in general a lot of breathing
A
room.
lot of space to operate.
Yeah.
But it feels like that foundation might be facing some cracks. One thing that really stood out from the research was Judge Larry Silberman
Oh, yeah.
and his dissenting opinion in a libel case back in 2021.
Okay.
He actually called for the Supreme Court to overrule New York Times v. Sullivan.
Wow.
That's a big deal.
That's a huge challenge to well-established law.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more interesting is Judge Silberman's influence,
Right.
especially in conservative legal circles.
Mm-hmm.
Your notes even mention his connection to Justice Thomas.
Yes.
And there's this Heritage Foundation event honoring Justice Thomas back in 2021,
Right.
where C. Boyd and Gray specifically brought up Silberman's impact on Justice Thomas's thinking.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And that connection feels really significant, and especially when you think about Justice Thomas's own history
Yeah.
with media scrutiny.
Yeah.
Think about his Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
Oh, man, intense.
That was so intense and so personal.
Absolutely. It was brutal.
And he faced really personal,
Yeah.
often very critical media coverage.
Very critical. And you can't forget his high-tech lynching comment
Right.
during those hearings, that second round of hearings.
Right.
It really captured how he felt, like he was being unfairly targeted by the press.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the hearings themselves. That our notes mentioned that Judge Silberman was actively trying to discredit Anita Hill at the time.
Right. He even suggested she was a lesbian acting out.
It's heavy stuff.
It's a lot. And it really makes you think, how those kind of deeply personal experiences
Right.
can shape someone's views on the press,
Right.
and then ultimately on libel law itself.
Absolutely. It's like a lens
Yeah.
through which they view these claims of defamation.
Absolutely. It raises all sorts of questions about how personal history informs judicial philosophy.
Yes.
Especially in an area as sensitive as, the balance between free speech and someone's reputation.
Definitely. Okay, so shifting gears a bit.
Okay.
Our sources also bring up this really intriguing concept of libel tourism.
Libel tourism.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So this is the idea that someone can sue for libel
Right.
in a country where the laws are more favorable to them.
More favorable to the plaintiff.
Exactly. The book Murder the Truth goes into detail about Rachel Ehrenfeld,
Oh, okay.
an American author who was actually sued in the UK
Oh, wow.
over her writing about terrorism financing.
Interesting.
And the thing is that the statements in her book,
Okay.
they barely made a ripple here in the U.S.
Right. Because we have stronger free speech protections here.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But she faced this lawsuit in London
Yeah.
where libel laws tend to be much more advantageous for the person suing.
Yeah, for the plaintiff, it's a different landscape over there.
Right. And that really highlights a vulnerability.
Yeah.
could judgments in foreign courts end up stifling free speech here in the United States?
That's a big question, a big concern.
And that's where Rory Lankman comes in.
Okay.
He was a New York legislator who recognized this threat.
Okay.
And he spearheaded this Libel Terrorism Protection Act.
Interesting.
It's interesting. Our notes connect this directly to the post 9/11 world.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you think about the bigger picture, national security concerns were so high.
Of course.
And there was this real desire to protect Americans from anyone funding terrorism.
Right.
So it makes sense that this would play a role in strengthening defenses against libel tourism. This act basically said New York courts wouldn't enforce those foreign libel judgments unless the foreign country's laws offered at least as much protection for free speech as the U.S. and New York constitutions do.
So they had to be at least as strong.
At least as strong, exactly.
Yeah. Now, we also get introduced to this new wave of lawyers who are becoming pretty prominent in the field of defamation.
Okay.
People like Tom Clare.
I've heard that name.
And Libel.
Yeah.
And they often represent clients who identify as conservative in these legal battles.
Interesting. So what's their approach? What sets them apart?
Well, Clare is described as, incredibly thorough and dedicated, like leaves no stone unturned.
A real bulldog.
Yeah. And Locke seems to have cultivated this deep interest in libel law over many years. It even goes back to her time in college.
Wow. So she's been focused on this for a long time.
It seems so.
This is really interesting because their rise seems to coincide with the growing influence of conservative legal activism. Organizations like the Federalist Society.
That's right.
And Judge Larry Silberman was a major player there.
Huge figure.
There's this 1992 speech of his that's considered a real pivotal moment. He criticized judges who questioned Clarence Thomas. And he really went after the media, calling them judicial activists.
Strong words.
It really captures that early conservative dissatisfaction with the judiciary and with the press.
Yeah. And then you fast forward to the 2016 election. And you've got Donald Trump's rhetoric about libel laws.
Interesting.
He made all these promises to open up these laws so that when the media publishes purposely negative and horrible and false articles, they could be sued more easily and face big financial penalties.
This is a crucial point.
It is.
Because Trump's attacks on the media, they weren't just about, specific stories he didn't like. It was a whole strategy to undermine the credibility of any coverage that was critical of him. Your sources even compare it to Newt Gingrich, who did something similar during his campaigns.
Publicly criticizing the media.
Exactly.
It's interesting how that strategy seems to work.
It does resonate with certain groups.
With some people. Yeah. Okay, there was also the case of Shelzen Berisha v. Guy Lawson. And the Supreme Court's decision not to hear this case. That became a big moment for people watching this issue.
I can see why. So what happened?
Well, even though the Supreme Court declined to hear it, which means the lower court's ruling stood.
They denied certiorari.
Yeah. Justice Gorsuch actually issued a statement.
Oh, wow.
With that denial. And he specifically raised concerns about the actual malice standard and how it had potentially become a kind of effective immunity for the press.
So even though they didn't take the case, he's signaling that these concerns about libel law are on their radar.
Yeah, they're at the highest level. And then, of course, you have the very public example of Peter Thiel.
Oh, yeah, Peter Thiel.
Funding Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against Gawker.
Through Charles Harder.
Yeah. That's like a deliberate strategic use of the legal system.
Totally. It was clearly motivated by Thiel's personal dislike of Gawker. And it shows how money can be used to silence critics in the media. And Harder, who represented Hogan, he had his own ambitions too. He saw this case as a way to raise his own profile, and he even wanted to challenge, maybe even overturn New York Times v. Sullivan.
It's a landmark case to take on.
It is.
The details of that trial are pretty wild.
Tell me about it.
A.J. Delario's remark during his deposition, which he meant as a joke.
I remember that.
Ended up being really damaging.
They didn't land well.
And the financial consequences for Gawker were severe.
They were.
They ended up going bankrupt.
Thiel's strategy was very calculated. He even seemed to anticipate Gawker's appeals.
Wow.
And brought in bankruptcy lawyers.
This Gawker case is often used as an example of lawfare.
Lawfare, yeah.
Which is essentially weaponizing the legal system.
Right.
It's not just about winning the case.
No.
It's about burdening the target.
Yeah.
Usually journalists or critics with so much legal cost and time that they self-censor or their work just dies.
It's a way to silence them without actually winning in court.
Our sources mention TechDirt facing all these legal threats over its reporting on tech. And even Mother Jones, a well-established publication, incurred huge costs from libel suits.
Even when they won.
Even when they won.
Ouch.
It shows how the process itself can be a punishment.
Absolutely.
Mother Jones had to spend over $600,000 to defend itself in the Vandersloot case.
Okay.
And they still won.
But then their libel insurance premiums skyrocketed.
Right.
And their deductibles went way up.
So even a small threat becomes a huge risk.
Exactly.
And it's not just the big organizations.
You know,
Jared Strong and the small Carroll Times-Herald faced a lawsuit for reporting on a local police officer.
Really?
The financial strain on that tiny paper was so bad, they had to start a GoFundMe page just to try to survive.
It's scary how even basic local news reporting can trigger these expensive legal fights.
And it makes those small outlets so vulnerable.
Incredibly vulnerable. It's a chilling effect on local accountability.
It's similar with Conrad Swanson's investigation into that Gold Hill Mesa development.
Oh, yeah.
It faced all these obstacles getting published in the Colorado Springs Gazette.
Because of legal threats?
Yeah, it's like investigative journalism is getting squeezed at every level.
It's getting harder and harder.
The case of Catherine McKee suing Bill Cosby and his publicist.
Okay.
That brings back the public figure issue.
Right. So how did that play out?
Because she decided to speak publicly after all those other women had come forward.
Yeah.
The court said she was a limited-purpose public figure.
Okay.
Which meant she had to meet that higher actual malice standard.
So even if someone's not actively seeking the spotlight, if they speak out on a big issue, they can be considered a public figure.
And that makes it much harder to prove defamation.
Exactly. The bar is higher.
And then there's Scott Stedman and Forensic News being sued in the UK.
Oh, yeah, by Alejandro Betancourt Lopez Soriano.
This feels like textbook lawfare.
It does. A foreign jurisdiction targeting someone investigating the Russian elite.
Yeah, it's all about silencing those critical voices.
The legal claims against him were so broad.
They were.
Even using data protection laws in new ways.
And the impact on Stedman was huge.
It was.
He ended up shutting down his whole outlet.
It's heartbreaking, but it shows how effective these tactics can be.
It seems like we keep circling back to Judge Larry Silberman.
It's hard to avoid him. He's a key figure in all of this.
Even just his background as a judge and someone who's been called an ideological activist, his involvement in Troopergate.
It all gives us more context for his views on the media.
His dissenting opinion in the Christianita case against Global Witness shows his criticism of media power and the New York Times v. Sullivan standard.
He argued that Global Witness basically implied bribery without enough evidence.
And that they were reckless with the truth.
He's clearly willing to challenge the First Amendment.
Yeah. In this area, at least.
At least in this area.
And the Berisha v. Guy Lawson case reaching the Supreme Court, even though they didn't hear it.
But Justice Gorsuch's statement.
Yeah, that statement was key.
Saying the actual malice standard has become effective immunity for the press.
It shows that some justices are worried about how libel law is being applied.
It does.
And then at that Heritage Foundation event for Justice Thomas, Carson Holloway argued against protecting libelous statements against public officials.
Interesting.
Even under the First Amendment.
So aligning with Justice Thomas's views.
Exactly.
It's like they're trying to build a case that the framers never meant to protect false and defamatory speech.
And we're seeing this play out in the States.
Oh, yeah.
Florida Governor DeSantis, reportedly influenced by Libby Locke, has been working to make the media more vulnerable to libel lawsuits.
So taking these theories and putting them into practice.
Yeah. And Locke's involvement is pretty significant.
It is. She's a major player in all this.
It's fascinating how even Alan Dershowitz, who's always been a huge defender of free speech,
he has
kind of changed his stance on libel law.
Really? Why is that?
He's worried about cancel culture.
Oh, interesting.
After his own lawsuit against CNN.
It's like he's seeing both sides now.
He is.
It shows the tension between free speech and protecting reputations.
Especially in this age of social media and online mobs.
Right, where anyone can be a publisher.
And then you have the case of Corey Tomsik suing the Wausau Pilot and Review for defamation.
Okay. A local case.
Yeah, with Matthew Fernholz, a Federalist Society member.
Okay.
Helping with the legal side.
It just shows how these broader legal strategies are trickling down to even small community papers.
The financial pressure on the pilot was intense.
And Eric Spofford's lawsuit against New Hampshire Public Radio.
NHPR.
Yeah, and Lauren Kulginian after their reporting on his recovery center.
That one was scary.
It was. With the threats and the vandalism.
It shows how aggressive things are getting.
It's intimidating.
But it's not just individuals or small outlets being targeted.
Right.
You have Dominion voting systems using libel lawsuits against those who spread that false information about the 2020 election.
Including their big case against Fox News.
With Claire Locke involved.
Of course.
It's kind of a counterpoint.
It is.
They're using libel law to fight disinformation.
Right, to protect the integrity of elections.
But even there, the actual malice standard is still key.
It's still the central issue.
And finally, you have Sarah Palin's lawsuit against the New York Times.
Oh yeah, that was a big one.
Over an editorial error.
Okay.
Even though they admitted the error, the judge ruled for the Times.
Interesting.
Because of that high actual malice standard.
So it shows that standard still has teeth.
And that was upheld on appeal?
Yeah. It's not going away easily.
So it's clear that libel law is in flux.
Absolutely. Not static at all.
It's being used strategically.
Yes.
Often by powerful people.
Often by the powerful.
And we're seeing all these challenges to New York Times v. Sullivan.
From all sides.
Yeah. It raises some fundamental questions about free speech versus protecting reputations.
Absolutely.
And this could have a chilling effect on free speech.
It could. Especially on investigative journalism.
The kind of journalism that holds power accountable.
The financial burden and the legal complexities are huge hurdles. So this is the big question I want you to think about.
Okay.
What does all this mean for the future of information and public discourse in the U.S.?
What responsibilities do individuals have? Media organizations.
The legal system itself.
Yeah, how do we navigate this?
It's complex.
It is.
There are no easy answers.
There aren't.
But now more than ever, we need your informed perspective.
Yeah, we need everyone to be thinking about this.
We do.
Because it affects all of us.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.